We are often taught that a wedding day is the pinnacle of a woman's joy, a fairy tale ending written in silk and lace. But beneath this gilded facade lay a darkness so profound that the moment a bride whispered, "I do," she did not gain a partner, but rather she extinguished her own legal existence. This is not a story of romance, but of erasure. In the treacherous courts of Tudor England, while history obsessed over King Henry's beheaded wives, a far more insidious mechanism was at work, a legal doctrine known as coverture. It was a system that seamlessly transformed living, breathing women into mere extensions of their husband's property, stripping them of name, wealth, and voice with the stroke of a quill. If you are prepared to uncover the silent nightmares buried beneath the history books, consider subscribing. And tell me, from which city in this modern world are you watching us unveil the past? Let us transport our minds back to the crisp, biting air of a Yorkshire morning in 1535, where the scent of beeswax candles and damp stone permeates the small parish church. Standing before the altar is a young woman of 19 years, a daughter of the merchant class, draped in a gown of velvet that cost more than a skilled craftsman could earn in a decade. Beneath the heavy folds of her skirt, she carries a leather purse filled with silver coins, the fruit of her own labour, earned through years of shrewd negotiation and careful accounting in her father's wool trade. She is vibrant, she is capable, and in the eyes of the world, she is a person of substance. But as the priest intones the solemn Latin phrases of the marriage rite, a fundamental transmutation is taking place, one that is invisible to the eye, yet catastrophic to the soul. With every syllable that falls from the clergyman's lips, the legal entity that was this young woman is being systematically dismantled. When her new husband slides the gold band onto her finger, it does not merely signify a union of hearts, but rather it acts as a seal upon her civil death. In that fleeting moment, the coins in her purse no longer belong to her. The velvet on her back is no longer her property, and the very thoughts in her head are legally subsumed by the man standing beside her. She has entered the state of coverture. She has transitioned from a femme soul, a woman alone with rights and identity, into a femme covert, a covered woman hidden entirely behind the shadow of her husband. It is a vanishing act performed in plain sight, applauded by the congregation and sanctified by God. Yet it is as absolute as if she had been lowered into the earth itself. The horrific genius of this system lay not in its brutality, which was often commonplace in the Tudor era, but in its bureaucratic efficiency. The ink dries on the parchment of the marriage register, and with it, the woman's existence evaporates into the cold air, leaving behind only a vessel for obedience and reproduction. She walks out of the church into the pale sunlight, but the person who walked in has remained behind, extinguished by the weight of the law. This was not merely a loss of property, it was a metaphysical annihilation. To the courts of England, she was no longer an individual capable of owning, dragging, or suing. She was simply an extension of her husband's will, a piece of human furniture that breathed and bled, but possessed no more rights to her own life than the chair she sat upon or the horse she rode. But to truly comprehend the suffocating nature of this existence, we must look beyond the wedding feast and into the cold mechanics of the law itself. This was not a random cruelty inflicted by sadistic men, but a structured reality grounded in centuries of legal theory and religious doctrine. The concept of coverture was derived from a literal interpretation of the biblical assertion that husband and wife were one flesh. However, as the renowned legal commentator of a later age would dryly observe in this union of two, the one is the husband. It was a doctrine that wrapped the iron chains of servitude in the velvet language of protection arguing that a woman was too fragile, too delicate to be burdened with the harsh realities of property and law. And thus she must be shielded or covered by the stronger sex. Yet this protection was a cage. Consider the terrifying practicality of this law in the daily life of a Tudor woman. Imagine for a moment that you are that merchant's daughter, now a wife attempting to continue the trade you know so well. You stand in the bustling market, surrounded by the smell of raw wool and unwashed bodies, ready to sell the cloth you have woven with your own hands. A buyer approaches a man you have dealt with for years, but he looks past you to your husband. If you attempt to strike a bargain to sign a contract for the delivery of goods, your signature is worthless. It is nothing more than ink on paper void from the moment it is written, because a non-person cannot make a binding agreement. You are a ghost haunting your own life, able to speak, but unable to be heard by the machinery of society. The horror deepens when we scrape away the veneer of commerce and look at the vulnerability of the body itself. Because the law regarded the wife as property, any wages she earned by the sweat of her brow belonged instantly to her husband. There are harrowing accounts buried in the dusty archives of ecclesiastical courts. Stories of women who worked themselves to the bone-washing clothes, brewing ale or spinning thread, only to watch their husbands take those hard-earned coins and dissolve them in the bottom of a tankard at the local tavern. And she could do nothing. To take back the money she had earned would be theft, to hide it would be deceit. She was legally incapable of owning a single farthing. To understand the full weight of coverture, we must descend from the abstract realm of legal statutes into the visceral reality of physical correction. The law did not merely strip a woman of her property. It authorized a regime of domestic discipline that today would be classified as systematic torture. Legal commentators of the era debated not if a husband could beat his wife, but with what instruments and with how much force. The common law allowed a husband to administer moderate chastisement to his wife, just as he would to his apprentice or his child. The term moderate was a horrifyingly elastic concept. In the enclosed privacy of the Tudor home, far from the eyes of the parish priest or the magistrate, the definition of moderation was determined entirely by the temper of the husband. We have coroners' rolls, those grim lists of the dead that tell stories of women accidentally falling downstairs or dying of sudden fevers, their bodies marked with bruises that the law chose to ignore. But the state's control over women's bodies, and specifically their voices, extended beyond the fist. It manifested in instruments of iron. Consider the Scold's Bridle, or the branks, a device that began to appear in England during this period. It was a metal cage that fitted over a woman's head, locking into place with a padlock. But its true cruelty lay inside. A metal plate, often studded with spikes or shaped like a rasp, was inserted into the woman's mouth to press down upon her tongue. If she attempted to speak, the spikes would lacerate her flesh, filling her mouth with blood. This was the punishment for the scold, a legal term for a woman who spoke too freely, who nagged, who argued, or who challenged male authority. Imagine the sensory experience of the bridle, the cold weight of the iron against the temples, the metallic taste of blood mixing with saliva, the inability to swallow. But the physical pain was secondary to the psychological terror. Women wearing the bridle were not merely silenced, they were paraded. A husband could lead his bridled wife through the market square by a chain attached to the mask, turning her into a spectacle of subhuman obedience. It was a piece of theatre designed to terrorize the entire female population. Every woman who saw a neighbor led through the streets in the iron mask learned a lesson that sank deep into her bones, that silence is survival. Your voice is not a right. It is a privilege that can be revoked by the smithy's hammer. If the laws of men could reduce a merchant's daughter to a mere shadow, consider for a moment what they could do to a queen. We often view the royal court as a place above the law, a realm of absolute power and glittering impunity. But in the Tudor era, The terrifying logic of erasure spared no one. The story of Catherine of Aragon is frequently told as a tragedy of romance, a discarded wife replaced by the younger, more captivating Anne Boleyn. But this is a superficial reading that ignores the true horror of her final years. Her ordeal was not merely a heartbreak. It was a systematic dismantling of her identity, a slow-motion execution carried out not with an axe, but with decrees and statutes. When King Henry decided that his marriage was invalid, he did not simply divorce Catherine, he rewrote her entire history. In the eyes of the law, she had never been queen. She had never been a wife. She was demoted to the title of Princess Dowager of Wales, a cruel designation that legally shoved her back in time to her teenage years as the widow of Henry's brother Arthur. It was a psychological flaying. Imagine sitting in a cold, damp room in Kimbolton Castle, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the stone, and knowing that the world outside is being forced to forget your name. Every letter she received addressed to the Queen was confiscated. Every servant who dared to address her by her royal title was dismissed or imprisoned. She was being erased while she still breathed. The sensory reality of her confinement was a masterclass in calculated cruelty. She was moved from residence to residence, each one more dilapidated and isolated than the last. The air thick with the smell of stagnant marshes and the rotting timber of neglect. The king, having stripped her of her legal standing, proceeded to strip her of her maternal rights, using the machinery of the state to weaponize her own child against her. Catherine was forbidden from seeing her daughter, the Princess Mary. This was not a side effect of the separation, it was the primary instrument of torture. The law dictated that the father had absolute custody and control over legitimate children. And since Henry had declared Mary illegitimate, he held the keys to her existence as well. Mother and daughter were kept apart not by stone walls alone, but by the insurmountable barrier of the king's legal will, leaving Catherine to die in a silence broken only by her own prayers. When the end finally came in January of 1536, it was less a death than a final expiration of a ghost. The official reports speak of a darkened heart found during her embalming, a detail often attributed to poison. But perhaps it was simply the physical manifestation of a life compressed and crushed by the relentless pressure of a system that viewed her autonomy as treason. Catherine's destruction sent a shockwave through the female population of England that was far more chilling than any execution. If the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, a woman of royal blood and immense political intellect, could be turned into a non-person by the whim of her husband, then what hope did a baker's wife or a farmer's daughter have? The message was carved into the very bedrock of society. No woman is safe, no position is secure, and your existence is a privilege granted by men, not a right granted by God. But there was one group of women who had historically evaded this suffocating trap. For centuries, the convent had stood as a sanctuary, a fortress of female autonomy in a world dominated by male ownership. A nun was not a femme covert. She was not property. Upon taking her vows, she became a bride of Christ, a status that paradoxically granted her a legal freedom denied to her secular sisters. She answered to her abbess and her order, not to a husband or a father. In the cloistered gardens and hushed libraries of the nunneries, women could be scholars, administrators, and landowners, wielding power that would be unthinkable in the outside world. Yet, in the hungry eyes of Henry VIII and his chief minister Thomas Cromwell, these sanctuaries were not holy places, but vast reservoirs of untapped wealth waiting to be seized. The dissolution of the monasteries, which began in 1536, was a catastrophe of biblical proportions for the women of England. It was not just a religious reformation, it was a grand larceny that shattered the only alternative to the servitude of marriage. When the king's commissioners arrived at the gates of the abbeys, they brought with them the violence of the state. They smashed the stained glass that had filtered the light for generations, melted down the gold of the altar crosses, and turned ancient libraries into scrap paper. Consider the fate of a woman like Alice Montague, the Abbess of Barking. For years she had presided over one of the wealthiest houses in the realm, managing vast estates, settling legal disputes, and employing hundreds of local workers. She was a CEO in a habit, a woman of immense consequence. Then almost overnight, the pen of the king struck through her existence, just as it had struck through Catherine's. The abbey was dissolved. The nuns were evicted. Women who had spent decades within the protective embrace of the cloister, knowing only the rhythm of prayer and the smell of incense, were suddenly thrown out into the harsh, unforgiving light of a world that had no place for them. The trauma of this displacement is difficult for the modern mind to grasp. These women were not merely unemployed, they were unmoored. They had no dowries to buy a husband, no skills for the rough trade of the market, and often no families willing to take back a mouth that could no longer feed itself. They became masterless women in a society that loathed ambiguity. The crown offered them meagre pensions, often paid irregularly, but money could not buy back their safety. Many former nuns drifted into the grim margins of Tudor society. Their vows of chastity mocked their spiritual authority, stripped away. The sanctuary was destroyed, and with it, the last physical space where a woman could define herself by something other than her relationship to a man. In this landscape of systematic erasure, there existed a singular macabre paradox, a grim irony that serves as the twisting, turning climax of our investigation. For a woman in Tudor England, the only true path to legal personhood, the only key that could unlock the shackles of coverture, was the death of her husband. It is a chilling realization that her liberty was inextricably bound to a corpse. When the funeral shroud was wrapped around the man who had been her legal head, the veil of the femme couvert was finally lifted, revealing for the first time a femme soul, a woman alone, standing in the cold light of autonomy. This transition was not merely a change in social status, it was a legal resurrection. Picture, if you will, the day of the funeral. The church bells toll a mournful rhythm, and the widow stands by the graveside draped in black, heavy bombazine. Society expects her to be consumed by grief, to be a vessel of sorrow, and perhaps she is. But beneath the tears and the prayers, a radical transformation is taking place in the ledger books of the kingdom. As the earth falls upon the coffin, the invisible chains that bound her property, her signature, and her will to the deceased are shattered. She walks away from that grave not as a fragment of a man, but as a whole entity capable of owning land, entering contracts, and wielding the power of the law in her own name. Historical records from the winding streets of London reveal that this class of women, the wealthy independent widows, became a formidable economic force, an anomaly that the patriarchy struggled to contain. Consider the visceral reality of a woman like Joan Dance, a widow who inherited her husband's brewery in the 1530s. Under coverture, she could not have legally sold a single pint of ale without her husband's permission. But as a widow, she stepped into the cavernous interior of the brewhouse where the air hung heavy with the pungent, earthy aroma of fermenting hops and the heat of the boiling coppers, and she took command. She hired draymen to haul the heavy barrels. She negotiated prices with grain merchants who had previously ignored her presence, and she sued men who refused to pay their debts. In the court records of the time, we see these women emerging from the shadows, their names suddenly appearing not as passive victims, but as active litigants fighting for their commercial survival. But this freedom was a treacherous gift, a double-edged sword that often cut the hand that wielded it. The spectacle of a woman controlling her own destiny was deeply unsettling to the Tudor mind, a violation of the natural order that demanded correction. A wealthy widow, was not viewed simply as a successful businesswoman. She was viewed as a loose asset, a rogue quantity of capital that needed to be brought back under male management. The pressure to remarry was relentless, suffocating, and often predatory. Suitors would circle like sharks, sensing blood in the water. They did not woo these women for their beauty or their wit, but for the property they held. A younger son of a gentry family looking to secure his fortune might aggressively court an older merchant's widow, seeing her not as a partner, but as a stepping stone. The widow stood at a terrifying precipice. On one side lay the loneliness and physical danger of a world without male protection, where she could be harassed, robbed, or cheated with impunity. On the other side lay marriage, a return to the sanctuary of a husband's home. But she knew with a clarity that must have been agonizing that the moment she whispered, "I do," for a second time, the cage would slam shut. The business she had built, the money she had saved, the legal voice she had discovered, all would be instantly transferred to the new master. She would vanish once again. If the life of a married woman was a form of imprisonment, one might ask what happened when the prisoner rebelled. What happened when the pressure of coverture became so intolerable that a wife snapped and killed her husband? In the modern world, we would call this murder. But in the twisted logic of Tudor law, it was something far worse. It was petty treason. This distinction is crucial and reveals the terrifying depth of the ideology we are investigating. Because the husband was legally the king of his household, and the wife was his subject, killing him was not viewed as a crime against a person. It was viewed as a crime against authority itself, a rebellion against the divinely ordained hierarchy. It was a miniature regicide. Therefore, a wife who killed her husband was placed in the same category as a counterfeiter of coins or a traitor to the crown. And the punishment for treason was not the rope. Hanging was considered too clean, too quick for a woman who had subverted the natural order. The penalty for petty treason was to be burned alive at the stake. Let us look at the case of Alice Arden, executed in 1551, a case that scandalized the entire nation. Alice conspired to murder her husband, Thomas Arden. When the crime was discovered, the retribution was biblical in its fury. While her male accomplices were hanged, Alice was sentenced to the fire at Canterbury. We must not look away from the mechanics of this execution. Unlike the myths of swift deaths from smoke inhalation, the executioners of Tudor England were often instructed to ensure the suffering was visible. A woman condemned to the stake was often stripped to her shift and bound to the post with iron chains. Faggots of wood and straw were piled around her feet. The sensory rule here is one of overwhelming heat and primal terror. As the torch was applied, the first sensation was not pain, but the roaring sound of the flames catching the dry wood, a sound like a rushing wind. Then came the smell, the acrid smoke of burning pitch, followed by the sickening, unmistakable scent of scorching hair and flesh. The crowd watched this not just as entertainment, but as a moral lesson. The burning of a husband killer was a ritual purification. The state was symbolically incinerating the rebellion inherent in female nature. It was a warning written in fire that the patriarchy is flammable, and any woman who strikes a match will be consumed by it. This law of petty treason remained on the statute books for centuries, a hovering threat over every unhappy marriage. It reminded every wife that while her husband could beat her with the authority of the state, if she raised a hand against him, she would face the fires of hell before she even reached the afterlife. Yet even within this suffocating machinery of control, there were whispers of resistance, tiny acts of rebellion that ripple through the centuries to reach us today. We must not make the mistake of thinking these women were passive sheep led to the slaughter. They fought back, not with swords, but with the only weapons available to them: silent subterfuge, and the manipulation of the very laws that enslaved them. We find traces of this resistance in the clandestine economies of the household. Wives would secretly hoard coins in the hems of their skirts, skimming off the top of the marketing money, to create a hidden purse of their own, a tiny reservoir of financial agency unknown to their husbands. Was this theft? The law said yes, for a wife could not own property, but morally it was a desperate reclamation of labor. We see it in the defiant wills written by women who technically had no right to make a will, attempting to bequeath personal items, rings, linens, secret savings to their daughters, bypassing the husband's control to create a matrilineal line of inheritance in a patrilineal world. And then there were those who burned. The story of Anne Askew, executed in 1546, is often told as a religious martyrdom, but it was also a supreme act of legal defiance. Anne had been forced into an unhappy marriage at a young age, a classic victim of the dowry system. She rebelled not just against the Catholic Church, but against the authority of her husband, seeking a divorce and eventually preaching the scriptures in London. When she was arrested and tortured on the rack in the Tower of London, a hideous ordeal, where her joints were pulled from their sockets until she could not stand, she famously refused to give up the names of her supporters. But her silence was more than heroism. It was a rejection of the male authority that demanded her submission. By refusing to speak, she denied them the power of her voice. She died a femme soul in spirit, if not in law, choosing the flames over the suffocating cover of a false retraction. The shadow of coverture did not dissipate with the end of the Tudor dynasty. It stretched long and dark across the centuries, infecting the Georgian drawing rooms and the Victorian industrial slums. It is a sobering fact that the legal erasure of women described in this story remained the law of the land in England and America until the late 19th century. The Married Women's Property Acts, which finally allowed wives to own their own earnings, were not passed until the lifetime of our great-grandmothers. For nearly 1,000 years, the legal standard for half the human race was non-existence. As we look back from the vantage point of the modern world, it is easy to feel a sense of detached superiority, to believe that we have left such barbarism behind in the dustbin of history. But the legacy of coverture is not so easily exorcised. It lives on in the unspoken assumptions of our culture, in the way women's labour is often undervalued, in the lingering questions of who controls the assets in a marriage, in the subtle pressure to merge identities. The silence of those millions of erased women creates a vacuum that history has rushed to fill with the deeds of men. But if you listen closely to the rustling of the old parchment, to the scratching of the quill in the court records, you can hear them still. They are the ghosts in the machine of our civilization, the silent partners in the building of the modern world. They ask us not for our pity, for pity is a cheap coin, but for our witness. They demand that we acknowledge the terrifying fragility of rights we assume to be inalienable. So, as the final candle is extinguished in the long corridor of history, we are left with a haunting question that lingers in the darkness. If the law could turn a living, breathing human being into a piece of property for 500 years simply by the stroke of a pen, what other monstrous fictions are we accepting as truth today that will horrify those who look back upon us? The ledger is closed. The verdict is yours.